team. So if you get a team today, I can talk to them at section today.
So just for the undergraduates, I was intending to bring the second paper study to class today. I gave it to the wrong person. So we're going to send it to you later today.
And who's your second?
So the subject today is the reorganization of the economy. As one of the great programmatic themes that lie beyond the limits of institutionally conservative social democracy. Before I go on and continue the discussion and the argument, let me step back and restate for you a picture of the general outline of the argument. So I am presenting the programmatic agenda of the course in two ways. First, I am presenting it in relation to the critique of institutionally conservative social democracy, a set of themes that lie beyond the horizon of this last great institutional and ideological settlement. And in this respect, I suggested 5 themes. First, the provision of public services. Second, the relation between finance and the real economy. These first two lie just barely within the horizon of the established discourse. Then, third, already beyond the horizon, the hierarchical segmentation of the economy between advanced and backward practices of production, and the way in which we can overcome this segmentation, which is responsible for both inequality and stagnation. Fifth, the practical basis of social cohesion and solidarity. Actually, I anticipated that theme. We discussed it earlier. And sixth, the organization of democratic politics and of the state, to which I hope to come next week. Now, this is a way of presenting the programmatic agenda of the course in relation to the established discourse, to the established limits of politics, and in particular in relation to the criticism of social democracy or social liberalism. There is, however, also a second, more fundamental way of presenting the programmatic agenda of the course that I now want to outline, just so you can situate our present discussion within this larger conception. So on this view, putting aside the criticism of social democracy, the progressive alternative would develop on 3 major axes. The first axis is democratizing the market, and in particular, disseminating in inclusive form the most advanced practice of production, now the knowledge economy. And that economic theme then has 3 major parts as I'm conceiving it in this argument. The first part is the one I just mentioned, the advancement of an inclusive form of the advanced knowledge-intensive practice of production by opposition to the exclusive form in which it now exists as a series of fringes within each sector of the economy. The second element in this economic program is the reshaping of the relation between finance and the real economy. And that theme has two sides. One side is what you could call the deepening of finance. That is to say, the tightening of the link between finance and the real economy. So finance, rather than just serving itself, come more effectively to serve the productive agenda of society. And the second side is the democratization of finance, the broadening of access to capital. Deepening does not require democratization, but democratization requires deepening. The third element of the economic program has to do with the relation between labor and capital. And that too has two sides, or two parts. One part has to do with the situation of organized labor in relatively stable employment. And the other part has to do with the situation of precarious labor, an increasing part of the labor force in every major economy of the world. So that's what I'm calling the economic axis. And it is the topic of our discussion now. The second major axis is the educational empowerment of the worker and the citizen. The transformation of the character of education and the creation of the practical institutional basis on which this change in the way of teaching and learning can take place. And this educational transformation then against the background of a change in consciousness, in our assumptions. The third axis of this interpretation of the progressive project is the deepening of democracy. The deepening of democracy is, on this view, the counterpart to the democratizing of the market. And in particular, the creation of what I want to call a high-energy democracy that is able to master the structure of society and to diminish the dependence of change on crisis. The counterpart to the creation of a high-energy democracy in this third axis of the program is the development of the state, of a capable state, which will also be a subject of our political discussion next week. So that's the fundamental outline. And I say it so that you understand that I'm working with two different ways of conceiving the program. One way that comes out of the critique of social democracy, and the other way that's more comprehensive, the one that I just stated, the second way, which is liberated from this, as it were, genealogical concern. Now, one of my reasons for stating these two versions of the agenda is to ask you right now, before we go forward, what you think is missing. Because we still have, after this week, the second half of the course, and plenty of time and occasion to incorporate elements that I may have disregarded. So, of course, it is true that something that I do hope to address is the relation of this project, which advances primarily in the space of the nation state, to the reshaping of the global order. And we can ask, and we should ask the question, what organization of the world is most likely to be hospitable to such a project? So that also forms part of the plan discussion. But what is it that I have not seen or not planned, and that I should include? You don't have to answer immediately, but if you have no immediate suggestion, please write to me. Yes.
I would say it may depend on what you mean by the educational empowerment.
Yes.
Because the more that we talk, the more that I begin to think about the shifts that would be required within the individual in terms of the way they view themselves, the way they view the world, the way they
Yes.
view their community,
Yes.
the way they view these structures. That seems like a prerequisite of higher
Correct.
democracy in a way that, and most of these things aren't currently touched by the educational program of our society.
Yes.
So is your idea of educational empowerment of the worker and citizen, does that include these sort of far-afield things about individual consciousness and group identity that aren't sort of in educational programs right
Yes.
now, or is that a separate matter?
Well, so the answer to that question is complicated, right? Because on the one hand, education has to deal not just with surface capabilities and content, but what within the conventional vocabulary of the pedagogues are called the social emotional capabilities, the psychological presuppositions that allow the young to profit from this ambitious kind of education. So that's part of education. That's part of the educational program. And that is therefore a partial answer to your question. But it's an incomplete answer because obviously the transformation of consciousness can't rest solely or even primarily on what happens in school. It rests on the totality of social experience. So in a sense, every part of this institutional program that I'm describing both helps generate and presupposes a change in consciousness. Now that suggests then also another kind of incompleteness. Every fundamental transformation is not just a transformation of the institutional arrangements and practices, but also a transformation of consciousness, as you have suggested. And we can't expect a transformation of consciousness to result solely from institutional changes. There has to be a contest in culture. And that is, as it were, the prophetic element in transformative politics, which transcends the contest for governmental power. So we have to talk about that also. You know, the political parties organize the contest for the power of the state, but no one organizes the contest over consciousness. That's the work of the religious and secular prophets. And there is no agent coordinating the narrow work of politics with this larger work. this is a puzzle. This is an enigma, right? I mean, take the example of the United States. So there's the struggle over the structure, over the economy, over the state. And then there's the voice of the American prophets, like Whitman and Emerson and Lincoln. And the history of the country is unimaginable without this prophetic element. So how does it live? How do we make this prophetic voice speak again? How do we come to criticize, not just to interpret the message, but to criticize it and change it? So these are great questions. And they go beyond the narrow limits of politics. There are no obvious answers to them, but I think they're vital questions. So you're entirely right to raise this issue. Yes?
Perhaps maybe towards the new politics. I'm wondering how your third point, the deepening of democracy, intersects with your fourth point about developing the nation state and also about the global world order.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, should the deepening of democracy be universal? Should that deepening of democracy be a universal goal across nation states? Because I'm thinking about John Rawls here, who said that it's okay to have undemocratic institutions and undemocratic nation states, as long as those nation states are fair within the eyes of the people who live within them. So I'm wondering, is this deep democracy something that only applies to nation states with underlying democratic values already, or is this something that should be expanded?
Well, I'm not sure I understand. So the program that I'm developing here and defending and discussing with you requires a deepening of democracy. It is therefore incompatible with a despotic regime, even when the despotic regime represents itself in the language of collective interest. The vanguard is the virtual representative of the people, as in the communist regimes. But in thinking about the organization of the world order, we have to accept the fact that not all states are democracies, even flawed democracies, and that the world order has to be, for the moment, an order that includes undemocratic states as well as democratic states. That's just the reality. That's not our choice. That's the point of departure. And so when we come to discuss the question of the alternative forms of globalization, that's one of the themes. So my basic attitude to globalization is analogous to my attitude to the market. So the conventional debate about the market is more market or less market. And I say, first we have to ask which market. And similarly with respect to globalization, the conventional debate is more globalization or less globalization. But like the market, globalization is not there on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. We can ask which globalization. We can define the specific character of the globalization that is now developing in the world and ask what should be the alternative to it. So, for example, the globalization that is now advancing in the world has as one of its generative principles that things and money should be free to roam the world, to cross national frontiers, but people should be imprisoned within the nation state. There's no basis in economic or political theory for such a radical distinction between the complete freedom that is desired for the lifeless and the unfreedom that is imposed on the living. So that's just an example of the specificity of the form of globalization. And I hope we'll come to that. Yes?
Piggyback a little bit on this one. So I get the view that you are proposing one program. A lot of things rely on each other. Most of them are not mutually, or all of them are not mutually exclusive to one another. And I was wondering if there are other progressive alternatives.
Of course.
That are mutually exclusive to yours and that we could talk about.
Well, of course, but I think here's the problem. So I've made a very deliberate choice here of trying to seize forcefully on this predicament of the progressives not having a project. And within the short space of these 12 classes, trying to explore a particular project. Of course, there are many alternatives, but in any programmatic discussion now in the world, the threshold objection and one of the great sources of skepticism, disorientation, and impotence is the feeling that there are no alternatives. So how do we overcome that disorientation? We have to have the picture of particular directions. No? So, of course, there are many directions, and I hope that not just in your comments in class, but in your writings, in the final essay that would engage the argument of the course, you will suggest alternatives. But I've made a conscious choice not to organize the course as simply a catalog of possible alternatives, because then each of them would have to be so sketchy that this wouldn't provide an antidote to the feeling that there are no alternatives. I've chosen a different direction, which is to try and fill in the space of a particular direction. And it's not a system. It's not a system in the sense of Marxist social theory, for example, the Marxist conception of capitalism, an indivisible package. It's true, as you suggest, that the different elements constrain and reinforce one another. But it's not a take it or leave it package in which, in order to implement such a direction, we have to implement all of it. It is true that if we advance in a particular part without advancing in other parts, we eventually come to limits which require us then to address other parts, and in this process of combined and uneven development. So it's, as you like, a structure and a direction, but not a system. Not a system in, for example, the Marxist sense. So that's been my working assumption here in the course. But it's clear that there would be many other directions. But it's no good to speculate about empty directions. We have to have something tangible and developed. Pedagogically or psychologically, my hope is that a tangible, developed argument then can precipitate counter-arguments and the formulation of alternative directions at a comparable level of detail. So that's the deliberate choice that I've made in the way of organizing the argument. I think that there's some practical basis for this also for the following reason. Now in many countries in the world, there is a latent principle of political division, which is the following. especially on the left or on the side of the left-leaning forces. One position says there are no fundamental alternatives left in the world. The calamities and misadventures of the 20th century discredited ideological adventurism. And what we have is to accept is the regulated social market economy as the feasible residue in the historical progress of humanity, and do the best with it. Improve it marginally with respect to both equity and efficiency, and abandon large reconstructive ambitions. So that's one position. Nevertheless, in all of these societies, there exist individuals and forces who nurture the view that this humanization of the established order is not enough, and that there must be something more, something that the social democratic compromise of the last century foreclosed. Unfortunately, that second position is rarely given content, theoretical and institutional content, and that's what I'm trying to do. And I'm very consciously trying to do it by developing a particular argument, a particular program, and not a catalog of programs. And trying to seize on the material as forcefully as I can. So, but it's, of course, then, that's just the very first step in this process. Because then you can ask, you can say, I too want a structural program, but not that one, this other one, in this other direction. That's fine, that's what I want. Because for those of us who believe in the imperative of structural change, what we most want is a dialectic of conflicting views about the content of this structural change. That's what we don't have. And the question is, how can it begin? Someone has to throw a rock into the pond, and then it has to begin shaking things up, even in the space of discourse. That's the procedure that I've elected, and it's from the so it's not a disinterested argument. It's an argument which I'm developing and defending the project that seems most promising to me. It's very hard. It's very hard because, as I said in the first class, we all suffer in our contemporary situation from a kind of programmatic aphasia. We don't know how to think or to speak programmatically. And that's part of this whole confusion of the history of thought. We have a history of classical social theory that talks about structure, but entangles the discourse about structure in a series of deterministic assumptions in which we can no longer believe. And then we have the contemporary social sciences and policy discourse that naturalize the arrangements of society and abandon the structural imagination altogether. So we have to teach ourselves all over again how to think and talk about structure. And I do believe that the best way to do that is by example, to try and do something particular as an example of what such a structural alternative would be. All right, so in this spirit then, let's proceed with the economic discussion. Now, last week I couched the economic discussion coming as it did in this sequence in the form of a critique of institutionally conservative social democracy around the central theme of a contrast between an insular and an inclusive form of the knowledge economy. But now, having in mind this restatement of the agenda, this larger statement of the economic themes, of the economic axis, before returning to the discussion of the knowledge economy, I want briefly to address the other two parts of this economic program: the relation of finance to the real economy, and above all, the relation of labor to capital. We briefly discussed the first, but we barely discussed the second in earlier classes. So first, to remind you of the discussion of finance and the real economy. The conventional way of thinking is that a competitive capital market will allocate resources to their most efficient uses. So if there is a problem, the problem must arise from some competitive defect, from some flaw in perfect competition. On an expansive definition of perfect competition, including access to information. So there may be a restraint on competition, or there may be asymmetrical information. And so long as we fail to redress the localized defect in competition, there must be regulation. So regulation is then the backup to competition on this view. And regulation consists in a series of localized regulatory responses to localized market flaws. What this view excludes is the possibility that there could actually be systemic alternatives in the organization of finance and of its relation to the real economy. And that is precisely the view underlying this argument that I now want to restate about the relation of finance to the real economy. We cannot, on the view that I propose, understand the relation of finance to the real economy on the basis of this established assumption. Different economic arrangements link finance and the real economy in different ways, either tightening or loosening the relation of finance to the real economy. And in particular, this conventional view fails to elucidate what in an earlier class I described as the three fundamental enigmas of finance. I remind you of them. So the first is that under the current arrangements, the production system is largely self-financed. Production is financed from within the production system itself on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. So what's then the point of all of that money collected in the capital markets that has only an oblique or episodic relation to the funding of real economic activity? Its productive potential seems to be to some extent sterilized. The second enigma is the following asymmetry, that finance seems to be largely indifferent to the real economy in good times because to a large extent the real economy doesn't need it, but becomes destructive in bad times. A financial crisis, then, threatens to overstep the limits of finance and to contaminate the real economy, harming real economic activity. The third enigma is that the part of financial activity that should in principle be central, which is the funding of the creation of new assets, and in particular the creation of new assets in new ways, turns out to represent a tiny portion of financial activity. So, for example, venture capital, understood in the broadest terms, is a minuscule part of the work of the financial markets, even in those countries, a large country, the United States, or a small country, Israel, in which it is most established. These three enigmas all have the same explanation and require the same kind of solution. The explanation has to do with the looseness of the relation under the present arrangements of the connection between finance and the real economy. And the solution is to tighten the link, to enlist finance more effectively in the service of production. And then in an earlier class, just to again remind you, I described two sets of ways in which we could hope to do that, the negative and the positive. The negative would be by developing a set of rules and policies that either discourage or prohibit financial activity that has no plausible relation to the expansion of output and the enhancement of productivity. Example, so options or futures contracts, which began in the commodity markets, serve a real purpose, which is the increase of liquidity. But it's not clear that they serve such a purpose in equity markets, where they seem to serve simply as an instrument for speculative gambling. Now, this is not an argument against speculation. It's an argument against a form of speculative activity that has no function in the real economy. So the issue in this way of thinking is always the relation to the real economy. Now, and then there would be the positive arrangements. The positive arrangements would be the innovations that would seek more effectively to tap the dormant productive potential of finance. For example, by using the power of the state to mimic the undone work of private venture capital, or tapping some of the vast resources in the public pension systems of the world and placing them in diversified portfolios, competitively and professionally managed for investment in emergent enterprise, and so forth. So that's just to recall the shape of the discussion from before. And I wanted to restate that because that's a part of the economic program, and to ask you whether in the light of our discussion in the last couple of weeks, you have any further comments or suggestions about that part of our project, which is the relation of finance to the real economy. As I mentioned previously, there are two sides to the goal, which we could bring under the label of the deepening of finance and the democratization of finance. The democratization of finance requires the deepening of finance. The deepening of finance is the enlistment of finance in the service of production, so that finance becomes a good servant rather than a bad master. The deepening of finance does not automatically ensure the democratization of finance, but the democratization of finance requires, as a presupposition, the deepening of finance. This is a whole program. And it has antecedents in history. If you take, for example, the United States, the financial reforms of the New Deal were truncated partial experiments with both the deepening and the democratization of finance. And particularly in one sector, the housing market, through the organization of a secondary mortgage market, which then became the single greatest source of finance in the United States. So it's not as if this were just an airy speculation. This is the deepening or generalization of a major theme in the economic history of the 20th century. Yes?
So I agree that we need to encounter this problem of the loosening of the relationship between the real economy and finance, but the way the existing system works is very lucrative for particular interests within the economy, particularly within
Yes.
the financial system.
Yes.
And that will trigger immense political pressure and struggle, really, as it did in the past during
Yes.
the New Deal. I mean, the Lochner era, the way
Absolutely.
the court dealt with it. So how do we deal with this pressure, with this backlash triggered by?
Well, so of course this is context dependent, but there's an analogy in many contexts. And in many countries, there is the basis for organizing a contrast between a coalition or an alliance of the interests of rentiers and the interests of producers. So I think that's the most significant answer to your question, that producers and workers, industrialists and workers, have shared interests in many countries. And no, they're not necessarily less powerful. How powerful they are or not depends on how they organize themselves. But in principle, they should be more powerful. Not just because they're more numerous, but because they represent the vital interests of the society. The rentiers represent a predatory interest, not the central interest of economic growth and national prosperity and strength. Take again the example of the United States. In the closing decades of the 20th century, growth in the United States was organized on the basis of mass consumption. And mass consumption had to be reconciled with a violently regressive redistribution of income and wealth that took place in the United States, as it did to a lesser extent in other North Atlantic countries in the final part of the 20th century. Part of the reconciliation consisted in replacing the idea of a property-owning democracy by the idea of a kind of fake credit democracy, made possible in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral. And then the progressive financial reforms of the New Deal such as the organization of the secondary mortgage market, were perverted and turned into an instrument of financial speculation. The creation of derivatives in the secondary mortgage market. So this was one part of the picture. Then another part of the picture is that the whole strategy of economic growth in the United States came to depend on a policy of easy money administered by the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and it was credit-fueled and debt-enabled. And that was made possible as well by the structural imbalances in the world economy. So the Americans ceased to produce enough goods and services that the rest of the world wanted. And instead of developing a productivist project, they then began to lean on debt and credit and easy money. And on the Chinese trade and capital surpluses. So the structural imbalance between the deficit countries and the surplus countries, deficit and surplus in both trade and capital, became, for the Americans, a way of evading the task of structural change and of developing a productivist project in the United States. The same thing happened in China. It was the reverse side. So the Chinese, instead of deepening their internal market and linking export-led growth to growth anchored in this deepening of the internal market, then evaded the task of structural change in China by having a form of growth that relied primarily on export to the deficit countries, beginning with the United States. So each country used the structural imbalances in the world economy to escape the task of internal structural change and the development of a more inclusive productivist project. So we have to understand this financial hypertrophy and this financialization of the economy in that context. So it's part of that larger picture, which is both a domestic picture and a global picture. Yes?
But the capital becomes amorphous, and it's not bound by boundaries anymore, I mean national boundaries. So
Yes.
this picture changes. It hasn't changed completely already because of China, but it will change in the future.
Correct. But sometimes people say that because there's a connection between the national and the global, it's impossible to have national alternatives because they're global constraints. I believe that that view is false because they're not at the same level. In other words, it wasn't anything about the global situation that forced the Americans and the Chinese to evade the work of internal structural change. It was the opposite. They used the structural imbalances as an excuse, as an instrument to evade the work of structural change. They weren't forced to do it. So take the example of China. For China to change its growth strategy, even today, there would have to be massive redistribution among regions, classes, and sectors. It's not just an accounting exercise. It's not something that can be done in a purely technocratic way. And that massive redistribution has to be politically organized. Then there has to be a struggle or a debate in the country. That's hard to do within the limits of a despotic system. So then it becomes easier to evade that work and to base the strategy of Chinese growth on this simple export orientation, which has as its enabling condition the American deficits. The Chinese surpluses are the reverse side of the American deficits. And before the crisis of 2008, the motor of growth in the world economy was essentially this perverse alliance of the American deficits with the Chinese surpluses. And that motor is broken and hasn't been replaced since. There are all sorts of alibis now in the world for not pursuing an alternative. And one of the alibis that is most commonly invoked is that globalization doesn't allow there to be an alternative. It's a lie. It's not true. It's as this example of the relation of finance to production illustrates. This is a great subject, and that goes in many different directions. And like many of these subjects that we're discussing, it has this following characteristic. It's technical. There are lots of technical details. You have to know finance. You have to know it from within. The vast majority of people who know finance from within are associated with the interests of the rentiers. The other people who have an interest in the structural alternatives, for the most part, don't know what they're talking about. And so and this is not just a problem about finance. This is a problem with respect to every aspect of the program. Somehow, in order to develop these alternatives, you have to be, at the same time, a technician and a visionary. Now, who can be that? But that's what we have to be. And we have to be not just in one department, but in every department. It's a tall order. So now let's come to this other theme of the economic alternative before we return to the knowledge economy: labor and capital. Now, as I began the discussion of finance and the real economy with a reference to the conventional way of thinking and to what's wrong with it, I want to do the same with respect to labor and capital. There is no dogma of practical economics more entrenched than the view that the returns of labor cannot sustainably, the returns to labor cannot sustainably rise above the rise of productivity. So this is a view almost universally shared within practical economics. It is false. So now, in some trivial sense, of course, it's true. If the rise in the returns to labor takes the form simply of a decree of a rise in the nominal wage, it will, of course, be undone by inflation. So that's the element, the very limited element of truth in this common proposition. But the proposition is false for the following reason. If we compare countries controlling for differences in factor endowments, such as the size of population or the wealth of natural resources, and control as well for the level of economic and technological development, so that we can compare only countries that are at similar levels of development, we find that there are striking differences in the division of national income between capital and labor. Now, how did they get that way in the first place? if this proposition is true, that the returns to labor are necessarily controlled by the rise in productivity, the divergence could never have arisen in the first place. And the fundamental explanation is that the division of national income between capital and labor is powerfully shaped by the legally established institutional arrangements that determine the power of labor vis-a-vis capital. That's how it's shaped, not by decrees that the minimum wage or the nominal wage will be such and such. Now, the process of economic innovation, both technological and organizational, requires that there be an upward pressure to the returns to labor. The cheapening of labor is regressive and inhibits innovation. So there isn't a simple contradiction between the interest in economic growth or economic innovation on one side and the interest in enhancing the returns to labor on the other side. There are tensions, of course. If there is a stark and unorganized divergence between the rise in the returns to labor and the structural transformation of the economy. But there isn't a simple contradiction. Now, what do we require in the contemporary circumstance for a progressive project in the reshaping of the relation between labor and capital? It seems that we have to distinguish between two parts of the labor market in these contemporary economies. Stable employment and unstable or precarious employment, which is now in every major economy of the world, an increasing part of the labor force. And at least in this historical circumstance, before we overcome this dualism in the labor market, we have to have different solutions for these two parts of the market. So let's take first organized labor or stable labor. In the North Atlantic countries generally, the labor law regime has been one or another form of what the Americans call collective bargaining. So it has been a contractualist regime. So the idea is that the employment relation is a circumstance of radically unequal power. So unequal that it threatens to turn the contractual relation between the employer and the employee into a facade. The idea of collective bargaining is that the reality of contract has to be reestablished in the special circumstances of the employment relation by allowing the workers to organize and to bargain collectively. So their collective organization then becomes a form of countervailing power, as it's called, that helps reestablish the reality of contract in the special circumstances of the employment relation. The collective bargaining regime has two generative principles. The first principle is that it is purely voluntary, by analogy to private contract. So the workers choose whether to organize or not, and then how to bargain within the safeguards of the law, of the labor laws. And the second principle is that the union system is then seen as part of the private economy and completely independent from the state. Now, this system developed on the basis of mass production. That is, in the historical period, from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, when mass production was the most advanced practice of production. The assembly of a large, stable labor force in large productive units, such as factories, under the aegis of big businesses. That was the core context of the representation of labor under this collective bargaining regime. What happens to the collective bargaining regime in economies that are characterized by sharp hierarchical segmentation of the economy between advanced and backward sectors? So the first characteristic is that the collective bargaining regime, because it is not organized to be automatically inclusive and solidaristic, tends to reflect and reinforce the underlying hierarchical segmentation of the economy. So, for example, in the most capital-intensive sectors of production, the employees and the employers have shared interests. The wage bill is a relatively small part of the overall cost of production. And the main interest of the employers is industrial peace. So they have common interests against everyone else, against all the other workers. So they don't, in principle, have opposed interests. They do have some opposition of interests in the short term, but the interests that divide them are secondary to the interests that unite them. The second practical consequence of the collective bargaining regime is that by its very nature, it tends to limit the demands of the workers to economic demands, wages and benefits, wages, benefits, and guarantees. It's not an organization of the whole labor force, and it therefore has an economistic tilt. Now, what's actually happened in these societies is that in all of them, to a greater or lesser extent, the level of unionization has decreased dramatically. So that now in all of these economies, only a relatively small percentage of workers in the private economy are unionized, and public employment has become the last refuge of unionization, because the state is organized by analogy to Fordist mass production. And it is the biggest producer or provider. It survives even as mass production declines. This is not the only labor law regime that developed in the course of the 20th century. There was another labor law regime, which we call the corporatist labor law regime. Initially in fascist Italy, and then disseminated widely in Latin America, and especially in the major countries, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. And adopted there not by right-wing governments, but by nationalist and left-leaning governments, by nationalist populist governments. The corporatist labor law regime politically became a device of controlled mobilization. The state helping to organize and mobilize its core constituency of workers in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy. And the corporatist labor law regime was then as well organized on the basis of two generative principles. The first principle is that everyone was automatically unionized, so it's the opposite of the contractualist regime. Everyone is automatically unionized according to their sector, and then there's a subsidiary territorial criterion. So there's a national system of unionization. And the second principle, the principle of corporatism, is that the unions are part of the apparatus of the state and are under the tutelage of the state, typically through a Ministry of Labor. Thus controlled popular mobilization. So the disadvantage, of course, is the loss of autonomy of the union movement, its manipulation by the regime. But it has also great countervailing advantages. The first advantage is that everyone is automatically unionized. So there's no struggle over initial threshold unionization. And the focus of attention then passes from the initial effort to unionize to the decision of what to do with union power. The union power is a gift of the law. It's not something that has to be achieved. The second advantage is that it is, by its nature, solidaristic or inclusive. So instead of reflecting and reinforcing the underlying hierarchical segmentation of the economy, the corporatist regime works against the logic of the underlying hierarchical segmentation. And the third advantage is that it tends to deflect the agenda or expand the agenda beyond merely economistic issues. So the national union structure represented by national leaders, they're major agents in national politics, and they then have objectives that go beyond wages and benefits and that have to do with the direction of national policy. So what's the solution? Given these respective advantages and disadvantages of these two regimes, the point of departure, the beginning of an alternative, would be to mix them up. So we would take from the corporatist regime the principle that everyone is automatically unionized, and we would take from the contractualist regime the principle that the unions are completely independent from the state. So there's a union structure parallel to the state. There are union movements, that is, there are rival labor movements, and those rival labor movements compete for position in this unitary structure outside the state. Just as in a democracy, different political parties compete for position in the structure of the government. And this is a simple example of one of the principles of institutional transformation, which is simply recombination. That is, you start with what history provides you with, and you mix it up with a purpose in mind. of creating this hybrid regime. So let's take that as an example of a proposal for the organized part of the labor force. Now we come to the second part. Yes?
Before we go there, wouldn't that lead to an incredible amount of competing strikes that in a highly diversified economy where every part is kind of essential lead to complete standstill?
To complete?
Or a large amount of standstill?
A large amount of which? I didn't hear the word.
Stalling, that nothing happens, that the economy basically...
Now, but why would that be?
So, if I, for example, have unionized all the train workers,
Yes.
and just the people who...
In the organized part of the economy, yes.
And just one part of these, either the conductors or the people who are taking care of the tracks, or maybe someone who is taking care of the train station.
Yes.
Just one part of this actually is striking, then the whole train service in the whole country breaks down. So if I now have in all sectors competing unions that have to prove to their constituents that they are valuable, you will have a larger amount of strikes. If you have a larger amount of strikes in a highly diversified economy with a fractured landscape of unions, I could imagine that you will have in total way less output over the years.
But you're assuming that the outcome of such a structure is to produce constant industrial militancy. That hasn't happened. It hasn't happened in the corporatist regime. So I think it's counter to fact. So the question is left open: what will the posture of these union leaders be? So we're imagining under the hybrid regime that I described that they're not just pawns of the state, that they have some autonomy, and that these different union movements are affiliated or not with political parties. So there's a national structure, and then there are rival union movements, and they compete for position in this structure through the elections, through the union elections. And they have to prove themselves to their constituents. Now, you're assuming that the way in which they would prove themselves to their constituents is by striking frequently, or by, but it's not clear that they would do that. And that's not been the experience under the corporatist regime, which at least in this respect is a fair trial of that, because the corporatist regime was organized as an automatic unionization of everyone. So the question of what their interest will be is unclear. For example, they might have the interest of not of striking, but of increasing the representation of the workers in the control of the enterprises, or having some kind of equity stake, right?
But how do I get that? Usually, so I have to see.
Well, because one of the reasons to go beyond a contractualist regime would be to favor a labor law framework that is more than narrowly economistic in its bias. So they might have a broader agenda. And an example of part of this broader agenda would be to be empowered to have a voice in the enterprises, or even to have some kind of equity stake. It seems to me that the practical experience might go in the opposite direction that you suppose, because if the agenda is narrowly economistic, that is just a conflict over wages or benefits, then that might more likely lead to perpetual strikes. The reason why it doesn't now, under the collective bargaining regime, is simply that the union structure has shrunk. Whereas if there's a broader agenda that is more than economistic, that traditional form of industrial action might become less central to the activity. They might act on a broader political horizon. Yes, go on.
Okay, I would like to push back just because I see see it more from a political point of view.
Yes.
When I see political campaigns, then having more people on the board of directors from the leadership of my union is really less important to me than a higher paycheck, and will give me probably less.
Yes.
It seems to me counter to the fact that how elections usually work, or large-scale elections, where economic benefits are really important. And there are some examples where this fractionalizing of the unionization leads to more strikes. So I know that we have this in Germany with our, that's why I talked about the
sure.
conductors. Same with our airplane pilots and.
But let me understand, the aim is not to suppress industrial action. Of course, if we had a situation of perpetual or constant strikes in every part of the economy, then that would be inconvenient. But there are no historical examples of that. There are situations in which there is a conflict between the workers and the state. If the state is, for example, as in some contemporary European countries, bent on a project of neoliberal reform, then the workers act against it, as maybe they should. But that's not a problem of industrial instability. That's the political conflict in the society, which is expressing itself in one form or another. And it wouldn't be part of the objective to deny the workers that power. After all, no one is denying the representatives of capital the prerogative of a capital strike, which goes on all the time in these societies. They don't like the policy of the government, they withdraw their capital. So that's what happens in these societies, right? So the workers then can withdraw their labor. In fact, they withdraw their labor much less than we might expect them to. Yes?
I don't know, I guess I sort of agree with him, because I feel like if the idea is to enhance and push upward the returns to labor, even if those returns are not purely economistic, it will, I can imagine resistance from capital.
Of course.
To the point where they would want to sow discord, such that consensus cannot be reached and solidaristic action is not possible. So we have to change something else that we haven't talked about yet in order for this to work.
What's the this?
I don't know. In order for this blend of the
of the two regimes,
of
the two regimes to work.
Of this blended model, this what you call the recombinant model, for that to work, something else in the mix needs to change, because I can see capital sowing constant discord in order to prevent the upward push of the returns to labor.
Sowing discord, you mean by cutting deals with parts of the labor force?
Or like, saying like so-and-so wants it. Just kind of, even in basic kind of cultural rumor mongering, if there are different factions of labor within the totality of full unionized labor force, it's in my interests as a member of kind of the ruling class,
of course,
the moneyed classes, to
that's what happens.
Get your factions to
yes,
fight with each
of
other.
course, but that's what happens. That's politics. That's life, right? I mean, you're treating that as if it were some kind of untoward event, but it's.
For improvement.
Excuse me?
I thought our goal was improvement.
Improvement requires conflict. It's not done technocratically, right? So you're describing the characteristic of a real society. A real society is a society in which there's conflict, there's contradiction, and the purpose of the institutional framework is not to suppress conflict and contradiction. It's to organize it so that it becomes fertile, right?
Isn't it also to kind of sort of surface and eliminate the kind of aggregate advantage in one.
So I think if I interpret you correctly, what you're suggesting is that at some stage, at some next stage, one of the practical implications of this empowerment of labor in the organized part of the labor market would be to suggest the importance of the development of vehicles for public investment as a supplement to private investment, so that the productive agenda of society did not rest narrowly or solely on the disposition of those who control capital to lend their capital. I think that's right. So, and that would then be a positive development. So you're enhancing this contradiction, and the contradiction is then creating the basis for a next wave of innovations in the neighboring area, directly related to the theme we discussed before, which is the relation of finance to the real economy. And one of the ways to tighten the link between finance and the real economy is to develop the facility for public investment. Now, public investment, and then we have a problem of institutional design, because we don't want the public investment to be managed dogmatically just from a central position. We want there to be a panoply of independent centers of authority, so that instead of there being one trade policy and one industrial policy, there can be a series of trade and industrial policies being experimented with simultaneously. And that would be a great advance. But I simply point out that a condition of that advance, as you yourself suggested, is to increase the level of tension in the society. So that's what's then generating the need or the occasion for the development of this vehicle of public investment. Now we come to the other side of the labor market in these societies, which is precarious employment. So yes?
Professor, these corporativist regimes,
Yes.
The automatically unionization works when you don't have competing trade unions to increase their constituencies. In your proposal to mix up both regimes, how would this work?
So first of all, let me just make a factual claim with which you may not agree. So the two of us are Brazilians. And Brazil has a corporatist labor law regime. And when it was originally designed, there wasn't divergent leadership. In the history of the corporatist labor law regime, not just in Brazil, but also in Argentina and Mexico, in the other Latin American countries that adopted this regime, there then developed these confederations, these central labor organizations that were movements. They weren't part of the law. They were after-the-fact creations. And they, in a way, anticipate the hybrid regime to which I referred informally, because they were movements that, with different political affinities, different programmatic objectives, and they then began to compete for position within the unitary structure of the union framework established by the corporatist regime. So the hybrid system that I described is simply the development or the formalization of that historical evolution. Because what it says is that there will be these movements, they will have different affinities, they will have different programs, and they will compete for position in this unitary union structure, just as the political parties compete for position within the structure of the democratic state. Now, that already happens. That already began to happen informally in the evolution of the corporatist labor law regimes. So we know for a fact that it can happen because it already does. And what this hybrid regime is doing is simply to organize that process. So it completes the transformation of the corporatist regime into something different. That's the basic idea. I don't see any contradiction or paradox in that, and because it's a transformation that has already begun, that's already existed. As the corporatist regime degenerated and became de facto free from the control of the state, it then was transformed in this way. And the hybrid regime is simply the formalization of that transformation with a larger objective. Yes?
But there is a difference between those two regimes, right? So,
Which two regimes?
um,
But you mean between the hybrid and the corporatist, or between the corporatist and the contractualist?
No, hybrid and corporate.
Yes.
So, for example, the unions pay the wage loss for even the party that is not in favor of the strike, because it's still a unitary.
Correct. So under the corporatist regime, there was a mandatory tax surcharge on the salary, and so the unions were all financed by the state. Now, already in many of these corporatist regimes, this tax has been abolished. So there's already this transformation, and I agree that the hybrid regime that I described is incompatible with this automatic financing by the state. It requires the development of an alternative form of finance.
That's not what I meant, actually. I meant that if the union in Brazil is striking, then even the faction that is not in the lead of the union there, because it's competing, the wage loss there is usually then compensated by the whole union. Whereas if I have competing unions, one union is striking, the other can't go to work as well, because the whole enterprise or company is just working. If both unions go to work, then this union still has a wage loss because of the decision of another union, and this is not compensated in.
But these are legal problems that exist under the contractualist regime as well. In the United States, there are debates in labor law about the extent to which workers are required or not to pay union dues. It's now a case in the Supreme Court of the United States, the extent to which workers who are not formally joined to the union are represented by them and so forth. These are pervasive disputes in labor law. It's not even a unique characteristic of the corporatist regime.
No, I know that, but these external effects in a democratic, sub-democratic system, in a union system, is a problem, because you can apply external effects to competing parties with which you compete for power. This is what I'm saying.
I didn't understand.
I'm sorry, I don't want to monopolize
Yes.
the discussion, but the idea is that if I have one party striking and the other party can't go to work because of that, then both of them have wage losses in total. This is because
I know, but this is going to exist. I don't agree.
This happens today as well, but
Yes.
these parties are not competing for votes in an election.
No, but this happened. No, I don't agree that this is a differential between these regimes. This happens now, even under a contractualist regime. The workers are represented by a union. The union under a contractualist regime decides to strike. Some of the workers don't want to strike. They're affected by the decisions of the majority that wants to strike. So that kind of a problem is going to exist. But it's another example of why contradiction or complication is not bad. It's good, on my view. So I think that's the more pervasive theme. Do we want to diminish the tension, or do we want to raise the tension? In general, we want to raise the tension, not to diminish it. Now, let me address the second part of the labor market, which is the problem of precarious employment. Mass production declines, and a new global putting out system is organized in the world. So what we view as the classic form of the representation of labor may turn out, in retrospect, to be a relatively brief interlude between two much longer periods in which labor will have been organized on the basis of decentralized networks of contractual arrangements. It was before mass production, and now it's beginning to happen again. For example, this context that I described of what happens in the knowledge economy. The vanguard, rather than spreading its practices to the whole economy, retreats into an inner sanctum. That's what I call hyperinsularity, and discovers a way to commoditize or routinize part of its business, which it then assigns or subcontracts to workers and firms in other parts of the world. It's what I call the sidekick. So then we have residual mass production, not as a leftover, but as a subordinate part of a process of production organized by this hyperinsular vanguard. And in this context, in every major economy of the world, more and more of the labor force comes to find itself in a situation of unstable employment under temporary labor contracts or contracts without the full force of the traditional safeguards, not represented, not organized, and without the protection of the law. So what the Marxists would call a vast reserve labor army is created in the world. And now, with the arrival on the world labor market of hundreds of millions of Chinese and Indian workers, now it's remarkable that on the whole in the world, the progressives have had no response to this problem. You would think that this problem would lie at the center of their concerns, because after all, their historical constituency is labor, organized labor. So a transformation of labor is a momentous event. There are two main positions in this debate, both of them unacceptable. So the first position is the right-wing position, the so-called neoliberal position, which attacks the prerogatives of labor in the name of efficiency and flexibility. Flexibility then becomes the euphemism for the derogation of the historical prerogatives of labor. The second position is the position of the traditional union leaders and the politicians associated with them. They denounce the contractual arrangements as a fraudulent evasion of the labor laws, and they seek to defend the interests of their traditional narrow constituency, the organized workers who remain in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, what I call the leftover. Now, this is a tragedy for the left forces, because this is a shrinking part of the population. Instead of representing itself and being understood in the society as the bearer of the universal interests of the majority, it comes to be seen, and ultimately to see itself, as just a special interest, a faction with sectarian interests. And then from that standpoint, the precarious workers are an embarrassment and not part of the constituency of the left, of the progressives, for which they would have a project. So somehow these two unacceptable responses have to be rejected. And we have to seize on this new economic reality. We can't suppress it by decree. And we have to master it in law through a project. There's no return to the old world of mass production and stable employment in the form of mass production. But that doesn't mean that we therefore have to accept a free-for-all in which radical economic insecurity is accepted as the inevitable consequence of the succession of practices of production. So now I'll just give you an example as a point of departure of what such a legal regime would look like. The legal regime to master this new reality of precarious employment and prevent the contractual flexibility from degenerating into radical economic insecurity. So there would be two principles that would stand at the forefront. The first principle can be described as a kind of sliding scale in which we say, we will use the facilities of contemporary technology to organize and represent these precarious employees. And to the extent that we fail to organize and represent them, there will be direct legal intervention in the employment relation. So in other words, the sliding scale is this. The more they are organized and represented, the less there is the need for direct legal intervention in the employment relation. The more they are organized and represented. And the less they are organized and represented, the greater the need for direct legal intervention in the employment relation. And that then brings us to the second principle. What is then the centerpiece of this direct legal intervention in the employment relation when it has to happen? It would be a principle of price neutrality. So it would say, it would in effect require, by law, that the remuneration of precarious employment be at least equal to the remuneration of analogous work performed under conditions of stable employment. Now, of course, we'd have to have all sorts of intermediate doctrinal categories to develop the criteria for the deployment of this principle, but that's not an insuperable problem. That's what lawyers do. The significance of this principle of price neutrality is to prevent the idea of flexibility from becoming simply a device or an excuse for the cheapening of labor. So flexibility, in principle, contractual flexibility, should not require the cheapening of labor. So genuine flexibility is distinct from cheapening. And the simple device by which to distinguish flexibility from cheapening is to generalize the principle of price neutrality in the form that I've just described. Yes?
It sounds like you're talking about a universal income guarantee.
No, it's not a universal income guarantee. That's something else. That's another debate. This is about the imposed legal terms of the employment relation on that sliding scale. When there is not stable, secure employment, what are the rules about the remuneration of labor? So the premise is that the worker has a precarious position. So it's not a universal income guarantee. It's a rule about how his labor is to be paid. And the rule says he has to be paid at least the same that would be paid to a stable employee performing that analogous work. So the situation of temporary or unstable employment or precarious labor disguised as self-employment, as in the case of an Uber driver, cannot be an excuse for the cheapening of labor. That's the principle of price neutrality. And it's a simple device, a simple legal and economic device for imposing the distinction between flexibility and cheapening. So, of course, this is just the beginning. But here's the remarkable thing. You would think that given the importance of this subject in the world, it would have already been the object of a vast debate, and there would be a range of legal proposals for the alternative treatment of precarious labor. In fact, there aren't. This has to be developed in legal and doctrinal detail, but with this objective in mind of rejecting the two false positions that I described a moment ago. Now, let me just, before inviting your comments, distinguish this short term in the treatment of the relation of capital and labor from the long term. So these two sets of projects that I've described for stable employment and unstable employment have to do with the immediate historical situation in which we have this dualism in the labor market. But the character of the project has to be defined by its long-term programmatic horizon. And let me then specify three elements of such a horizon. They've all been mentioned earlier in the course, but they now acquire a greater significance in this moment of the argument. So the first element has to do with the relation between worker and machine. No one should be condemned to do work that can be done by a machine. The machine does for us everything that we have learned how to repeat, and its point is to allow us to reserve our time for the not yet repeatable. A worker who is condemned to mimic the movements of his machine, as the worker did in Adam Smith's pin factory or Henry Ford's assembly line, is not free. So that's the first element. The worker runs ahead of the machine. And the combination of the anti-machine, the human being, with the machine is more powerful than either of them alone. The second element in this long-term horizon is the conception of free labor. So a free economy is organized on the basis of free labor. There are three main forms of free labor: economically dependent wage labor, self-employment, and cooperation. The universal thesis of the liberals and the socialists in the 19th century was that economically dependent wage labor is an inferior, a defective, and transitory form of free labor, retaining many of the features of slavery and serfdom. And it was only in the late 19th century that the predominance of economically dependent wage labor as the primary form of free labor was naturalized. And now in the 20th century, we began to think of it as the most natural thing in the world. But up to then, it wasn't. economically dependent wage labor should give way in the course of time to the two higher forms of free labor, which are self-employment and cooperation. And cooperation making it possible to combine self-employment with economies of scale. Now that then leads to the third element in the long-term horizon. We can't imagine a contemporary economy as if it were an economy of yeomen or artisans or small-scale proprietors. So the ascendance of the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation, in turn requires a fundamental transformation of the basic structure of private law, the law of property and contract, so that the market economy cease to be pinned to a single version of itself, so that there exist many alternative mechanisms of decentralized access to productive resources and opportunities. The unified property right, an invention of the 19th century, is only one of those forms. And it has a purpose in some parts of the economy. It has an advantage. The advantage of the traditional unified property right is that it allows an economic agent, an economic entrepreneur, to do something in which no one else believes. He doesn't have to secure consent. He doesn't have to lift anyone's veto. But in other parts of the economy, we would want to create a system of disaggregated, temporary or conditional claims on productive resources, so that different right holders, workers, local communities, local governments, as well as investors, can have superimposed claims on the same productive resources. And then we have a different way of organizing the decentralization of economic initiative, so that we can have more decentralization and more aggregation of scale at the same time. So I go back to a point made earlier about a contradiction in the most abstract idea of the market economy. Even at the most abstract level, a market economy has at least two dimensions. One dimension is the absolute level of decentralization, the number of economic agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. And the second dimension is the degree of control, the absoluteness of the control that each of those agents enjoys over the resources at his command. Is it unconditional? Is it eternal? Or is it limited and temporary? Now, in the 19th century legal theory, which lives on in neoliberal ideology and in practical economics, it is imagined that these two dimensions of the abstract idea of the market go necessarily together, but they don't. In fact, there's a contradiction between them. Because in order to increase the absolute level of decentralization, we may have to experiment with different ways of limiting the absoluteness of the control. So by having property rights that are disaggregated or temporary or conditional, we may be able to increase the level of absolute economic decentralization. So this experimentation with the basic institutional and legal form of the market is then the background, the indispensable background, to the other two elements of the long-term horizon. The progression to the higher forms of free labor, and in that context, the transformation of the relation between the worker and the machine. So we'll begin the next class with the discussion of this, of the short term and the long term, in the transformation of the relation between capital and labor. So a vital element of any progressive project. And you remember that for Karl Marx, the most salient characteristic of capitalism, the single most salient characteristic, is that human labor is bought and sold. And so what we're discussing here is something that goes to the essentials of a progressive project. We'll begin next week with a discussion of this theme.
Another reminder, we'll be uploading the paper topic.
Yes, the undergraduate paper will be on the website. Peter, you'll send an email to all the undergraduates with the paper. Can you come to my office? I'll give you the paper too right now.
Okay, I'll do that, yeah.
I like that. Yeah. I'm desperate for a person to be and you can't tell by the lack of into the back.
No, this is, I mean, basically anything when you play
Right, yeah. Cool.
Another